My name is Stephen Roberts, and I'm one of the lecturers on the programme who is based at the South Wales Baptist College. So the areas that I teach in on the programme are in the area primarily of Christian theology of one sort or another. And one of the areas that I teach is Christian ethics. And I find this a particularly interesting module to teach. I mean, of course, I find it very interesting in itself. It raises lots of interesting questions about how we approach ethics, how we think about ethics, what ethics is, how Christian ethics relates to other forms of ethics and other approaches to doing ethics. And then, of course, the particular topics such as the ethics of race or euthanasia, some of these sort of big questions that we explore, I also find particularly interesting and, of course, very important questions for us to be addressing. But one of the things I find particularly interesting about teaching in Christian ethics and teaching it in a university context such as Cardiff provides is that people come from a diverse range of backgrounds. So there are some people who come to study the module from the basis of their own commitment to Christianity, but there are people who come from other different religious traditions and indeed from no religious tradition, from a more kind of secular perspective. And I think that is really important and valuable, that we have this space in society where we can have these kind of conversations about ethics that are across the divide of different religious and non-religious perspectives, because as a society, in thinking about these really big questions that face us, that's the sort of conversation that we need to be having. And so to be studying Christian ethics in that kind of diverse context, I think is really important. And so if you're watching this video with a view to considering coming to study at Cardiff, I hope you come, because whatever perspective you bring, it will be a valuable contribution to that conversation, which I find really rewarding. And I enjoy teaching Christian ethics in that kind of environment, in that kind of diverse group of people. And this actually leads to one of the questions that I pose as an essay question actually in the Christian ethics module, which is this: is Christian ethics just for Christians? Now, at one level, of course, the answer is straightforward. Well, of course, Christian ethics is primarily for Christians. The clue is in the name. If there weren't for Christians, then there wouldn't be Christian ethics, because Christian ethics is the kind of ethics that Christians seek to live by. And it also refers to the discussion of, well, what is a Christian approach to a question like race, or euthanasia or abortion, or whatever the question may be. So important questions have Christian perspectives. But the reason I pose that question is because one of the things that really interests me is whether those answers that Christians come to, or approaches that Christians develop within the field of Christian ethics, are only of relevance to Christians, or whether actually others can engage with Christian ethics and find them a valuable source of wisdom and insight. And the significance of this question really comes out, I think, most strongly in my teaching of environmental ethics. And so that's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. So Willis Jenkins, in his book Ecologies of Grace, Environmental Ethics and Christian Theology, looks at some of the secular, not specifically Christian or religious approaches to environmental ethics, and notes three distinct strategies in thinking through the ethics of the environment and ethical response to the ecological crisis. The first is a strategy which is based on raising the standing of nature. So in order to address the challenge of the destruction that human beings are doing to nature, we need to raise nature's moral standing, its status. So rather than thinking of it as something that human beings can exploit, we need to think about the natural world differently. The second is the strategy of moral agency, to actually appeal to the agency of human beings and seek to change the way that human beings act in relation to the environment, to the natural world. So it's very much a kind of anthropocentric approach, it puts human beings at the centre and say we must change the way human beings act. That's the kind of it's the strategy of moral agency. Or thirdly, is the strategy of ecological subjectivity, which is to do with changing the whole way we understand our relationship to nature, or even, well, when I say our understanding of our relationship to nature, that assumes human beings here, nature over here, whereas in fact this kind of notion of ecological subjectivity is really trying to see our relationship to nature as being integral. It's not us and nature, it's nature and us as part of nature. So really kind of rethinking the way we see ourselves. And within Christian ethics, Willis Jenkins notes that one can see parallels to each of those three strategies. So there is an approach of eco-justice based on raising the theological status of creation, understanding differently the way we see creation. So there are some quite radical approaches to this, such as the ecofeminist Sally McFaig says we should think about the world as God's body. She's not saying the world is God's body, it's a metaphor that she's using. And that by raising the status of creation in that way, we will think differently about it and treat it differently. If the world is God's body, then if we think about the world in that way, using that metaphor, then that might shift the way we relate to the natural world and how we treat it. There are others, for example, the evangelical Christian environmental organisation called Arosha uses the language of stewardship and suggesting that inspired by the biblical sort of idea of human beings as created in the image of God to be stewards of the creation, to take care of creation. This is a kind of Christian ethical version of the strategy of moral agency, appealing to human beings as stewards as part of their Christian discipleship. And then the third strategy of ecological subjectivity is really kind of trying to rethink the way we understand ourselves in relation to creation in a much more kind of holistic way. And this, for example, flows out of, although I've used Sally McFaig as an example of the raising nature's standing by thinking about the world as God's body, really her ultimate goal is to have a fundamental rethink of our relationship to the natural world, or seeing ourselves in and part of the natural world. And there are other examples of that third strategy. But a fairly recent document from the Catholic Church, Pope Francis's papal encyclical Laudato Si, is an invitation to think about how we care for what he calls our common home. So the subtitle is on care for our common home. Now, usually papal encyclicals are primarily addressed to Catholics, but this is an example of Catholic social teaching. So it's Catholic ethical thought that is concerned with questions that are not just facing Catholics, but facing society as a whole. So this is a really interesting example of my question: does Christian ethics, is it just for Christians? Because in this text he begins by saying, I would like to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. And so in his in this text where he says, I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet, we need a conversation that includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. So we're in this together, and if Christian ethics is going to have a contribution, then it needs to be made in dialogue. And he suggests that it does have a role to play. And there are elements of all three of Jenkins's strategies. Jenkins's book was written before the encyclical. There are evidence of all three strategies in what he says there. And I just want to mention one of them that I find particularly interesting. He talks about the bishops from Brazil and a document that they wrote and in it he says that nature as a whole not only manifests God, but is a locus, that means a place of his presence. The spirit of life dwells in every living creature and calls us to enter into relationship with him. Now, this is an example of raising the status of nature by seeing it as a place, a locus of God's presence. And this notion of the spirit dwelling in every living creature is a really quite radical vision of the divine presence infusing the world. Now he goes on to say this is not to forget that there is an infinite distance between God and the things of this world which do not possess God's fullness. But yet he's already said that the Spirit of God is alive in the world. And so this is really an interesting example, I think, of raising the status of nature, similar to what Sally McFague is doing when she's talking about the world as the body of God. When we look at the natural world, we have to see it as not only through the eyes of God, but in some senses having... It's hard to really sort of pick up and extend his language without falling into what he's trying to warn against, which is breaking down the distance between God and the things of this world. But this is why I find it so interesting, that it's almost as if he's trying to kind of give with one hand and then, but actually I've gone too far, and hold back, because there's a sense of the radical nature of what we need to do to reconceive our understanding of the world to respond to the environmental crisis. And the final point I want to make is about how that has been picked up. When this first came out, George Monbiot, the secular commentator who works in this kind of area and writes a lot in this area, particularly, for example, in The Guardian, had a really interesting response to the encyclical Laudato Si when it came out. And he said, why did most of us who were involved in environmental campaigning get involved in this task, in this work? And he says it's because of love, ultimately. It's about loving the world. It's about caring for nature. It's not simply a response to economics and statistics and all those kind of things that often people bombard us with when they want us to change our behaviour. It's actually about love. And so here is an example, I think, a really good, a really interesting example of Christian ethics being not just for Christians, but opening up a conversation about how we actually go about responding ethically to the environmental challenge. Thank you for listening. I hope that we may have a chance to talk further about such things